Debian, a Linux distribution that has a very large following and a lot of respect. With its first release, back in 1993, Debian is one of the oldest and highest respected distros around, and to say it's an important project would be an understatement. Many popular distributions even use it as their foundation, and here we are, 30 years later, with a brand new release of Debian. In this video, we're going to check out Debian 12. Hello again everyone, and welcome back. In this video, I'm very excited to bring you my full review of Debian 12, which was released this week. The 12th release of the popular distribution features Linux kernel 6.1, GNOME 43, as well as updated packages across the board. As for me, I've been using Debian 12 for quite some time. I installed it about a month ago ahead of the final release to get an early look at what the new release was going to be like. I'm very excited about Debian. It's one of my favorite distributions, so this is a distro that I take very seriously, and so far I've really enjoyed my experience with it. And during the time that I've spent with it, I ran it on virtual machines as well as physical devices, including one of my laptops. Not only that, I also built not one but two Kubernetes clusters on Debian 12, so I definitely put it through its paces. And overall, I could tell you that Debian 12 is a very impressive release. Although some antiquated design decisions hold it back a little bit, make no mistake, this is the best version of Debian ever. It's a treat for longtime Linux users while also being a great jumping on point for newcomers. So in this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts on Debian 12 and I'll explain why I feel like it's the best Debian ever. And for those of you that have been following my channel for quite some time, make sure that you stay tuned until the very end because there's going to be a surprise ending that you won't see coming. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's dive into Debian 12. And here it is. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a screen capture from a fresh installation of Debian 12. It's installed on real hardware, not a virtual machine, so that way you'll have a more authentic look at the distribution since it's running right on the metal. For those of you that are new on this channel, I always use real hardware for my reviews and not virtual machines unless I tell you otherwise. And if that sounds good to you, make sure that you subscribe to Learn Linux TV because there's definitely a lot more where this came from, because there's all kinds of Linux goodness on this channel, with a lot more coming. Anyway, if you're seeing Debian 12 for the very first time right now, it may not seem like much. At first glance, it looks like your average GNOME desktop. And actually, if that's what you think, you're right. That's exactly what it is. But it's also more than that at the same time. And Debian itself has always featured one of, if not the largest software repositories of Linux packages around, and although the GNOME desktop is considered the default, other desktop environments such as Plasma, XFCE, Mate, Cinnamon, and others are featured too, so you can easily install more than one at the same time. For the most part, Debian doesn't theme any of its desktops. The included software is generally unaltered and presented to you exactly as the developers intended. As a result, as we take a look around the desktop, nothing really stands out as super artsy or in your face, but at the same time, what we do have here is a very solid selection of included software. As with all releases of Debian, this new release brings with it the latest versions of all of its core applications. Or latest enough anyway, more on that later. Just some of the highlights here include Linux kernel 6.1, GNOME 43, Plasma 5.27, and a ton more. And one of the reasons why I'm pointing all of that out is to make sure you understand that Debian is the sum of all of its parts. It includes the Linux kernel, obviously, but also a very large curated list of software that's known to be reasonably trouble-free. Debian 12 is the latest version of Debian Stable, so it literally has stable in the name, so that's why this is very important. It's not about this package, this new feature, that new feature. Debian intends to give you a stable and reliable platform that you can depend on. And so far, every release of Debian Stable has given you exactly that. And Debian has never been a distribution intending to wow anyone, as it's more akin to a loyal friend that's always reliable and there for you rather than someone trying tirelessly to entertain you. Debian might not be a hit at parties, but it'll never let you down. And this is because Debian doesn't call too much attention to itself. Instead, it lets the software do the talking. GNOME 43, for example, which is the default desktop environment, is a notable improvement over GNOME 3.38, which was shipped in Debian 11, and since then, GNOME has implemented horizontal workspaces a brand new toolkit, a redesigned quick settings menu, and a lot more. For those of you that are oppositional toward GNOME, or maybe you just have a different preference, Plasma is a fantastic desktop environment, and even though it's not the default, version 5.27, which is what's made available in Debian 12, is probably more noteworthy than GNOME, especially considering that this version is the last major version of Plasma's 5 series that'll ever be released. So this couldn't possibly have been timed better. This means that if you're a fan of the Plasma desktop, you'll have the most current version for quite a while, up until the project releases version 6.0 at some unknown time in the future. So, for all of you Plasma fans out there, how does it feel to be so darn lucky? I mean, here I am, a big fan of GNOME, that's my preferred desktop environment, but the version that I get is one major version behind, but you guys, no, you guys get the latest and greatest, and that's awesome. And as great as Plasma and GNOME happen to be, those are just two options when it comes to the available desktop environments in Debian 12. There's quite a few available. If you install Debian 12 with the Net installer, for example, then you'll see this screen during installation that asks you which desktop environment you want to go with. You could choose 1, 2, or even all of them if you want. So when it comes to desktop environments, Debian 12 has all the greatest available right from the installer. Let's switch gears and talk about performance and stability. And considering that Debian literally has stable in its name, the bar for this is set very high. Like I mentioned earlier, I started using Debian 12 around a month or so ago since I was curious to check it out. I even upgraded some of my servers to it, even though it was technically still considered testing at the time. Now, normally it's a very, very bad idea to implement something in production that's not been blessed to be production ready, but then again, I have an unfair advantage. I own the company, and I can do whatever the heck I want. Also, I don't have any employees that'll get upset at me if I break something, so basically I have free reign over the infrastructure, and that's really fun. And the thing is, I didn't run into a single issue at all even before final release, and after final release, Debian 12 continues to be a very good distribution. Anyway, I tested Debian 12 on a laptop as well as a few virtual machines, and at no point did I run into a single glitch, pause, or crash, or any other type of fail. And that seemed to be a very good sign. And even as Debian testing graduated to become Debian 12, I continued to see good results. I even deployed a couple Kubernetes clusters on Debian 12 to see what would happen, and it worked just fine. In fact, at one point, a Kubernetes deployment on Debian 12 was so smooth that I was in disbelief. I thought something had to go wrong, especially given Murphy's Law, but I was unable to find any issues at all. Everything just worked. Regarding performance, I'd say that Debian 12 is the most responsive version of Debian that I've ever used. It boots faster, applications open faster, it really feels fast. Of course, it's been quite a while since Debian 11 was released, so there's been a great deal of optimizations in the underlying packages since then, but that goes without saying. Also, Debian implemented Ubuntu's triple buffering feature, which until now was specific to Ubuntu, not because Ubuntu was keeping it to themselves, but for whatever reason, the patches haven't been accepted by upstream GNOME as of yet. However, triple buffering support is here in Debian 12, and it does seem a great deal more responsive. Now, it's impossible to know how much of this perceived speed boost is due to those patches, but whatever it is, I'll take it. Taking a quick look around the default desktop experience, in Debian 12, like I mentioned before, we have GNOME 43 as the standard desktop environment, which coincidentally is my preferred environment anyway. And each of the expected GNOME apps are present and upgraded several versions ahead of what was offered in Debian 11. And here, we can see that the GNOME desktop has come a long way since that previous release. In the past, workspaces were shown vertically, but now they're shown horizontally. Personally, I prefer this. Now, of course, that in and of itself isn't going to be a killer feature, but it is a big change. GNOME itself has implemented many smaller improvements all across the board, including a redesigned quick settings menu, a more responsive Nautilus file manager. I mean, there's just a lot to love about GNOME 43. And the desktop experience overall in Debian 12 is just really, really good. It's fast, more modern. They did a very good job when it comes to implementing GNOME 43 in Debian 12. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself here. I mean, I'm talking about the desktop experience, but we haven't even seen the installation process yet. So let's take a look at that now. When it comes to the installation process, well, not much has changed in Debian 12. And the process will likely be confusing for newcomers, but at the same time, it's not all that hard either. The primary installer will ask a bunch of questions along the way, which may be overwhelming to some users, but for intermediate users, as well as advanced users like myself, we really do appreciate all of the many prompts during installation because that gives us the ability to fine-tune our installation to our needs to the point that we have more control with Debian's installer than with most installers out there. In addition, there's also a collection of live images available as well, which allow you to test out Debian 12 before installing it. Each one of these will feature one of Debian's supported desktop environments. For most desktop users, these are the versions that I'd recommend. Not only do they give you an opportunity to test drive one of the desktops, they also feature a simpler installer. Sorry to interrupt myself, but I just wanted to let you know that I really enjoy making this content for you guys. I have a ton of fun. If you enjoy the content that I produce, then please consider supporting Learn Linux TV. The thing is, producing content like this isn't cheap. So by giving back to the channel, you can help me make even more content for you guys. And to find out more about how you can support Learn Linux TV, what you could do is go to support.learnlinux.tv, and there you'll find some of the ways that you can help support the channel. Anyway, let's get back to the video. And the basic rule of thumb that I recommend following is to use Debian's standard installer on servers or any workstation where you want to heavily customize it, while the live installer should be used for basically everything else. So far, Debian 12 seems like a slam dunk, and I have no shortage of great things to say about it, but what are the downsides? Well, I did have downsides, and Debian just went and fixed one of them, and then the other downside is no longer relevant, so actually I have nothing to complain about. And one of the downsides that I often complain about with every review of Debian that I do is the fact that its software often feels very antiquated even on release day. And technically, that's still true here. For example, Debian 12 ships with LibreOffice 7.4, but the final point release of the 7.4 series was released last month, and the developers even recommended that you stop using it and move to LibreOffice 7.5. So Debian literally contains a major software suite at a version that the developers themselves don't even recommend that you use. And what's worse is that the way that Debian works is that major software versions are never upgraded and are locked in until the next release. In this case, that means we won't have anything newer than LibreOffice 7.4 in Debian until Debian 13. And this is one of the reasons why Debian has never become my daily driver distribution. The software is just too old. Don't get me wrong, if you include bleeding-edge software into a Linux distribution, then it is the case that you're introducing instability. And with Debian being, well, Debian stable, it's supposed to be stable, hence the name, they have no room for unstable software because that goes against their plan. But at the same time, the software in Debian is often prehistoric. It's many versions behind, and software doesn't need to be many versions behind in order to achieve stability. And the fact that the software is so old just makes it a pain to use. But thankfully, due to new technologies within the Linux community, that's not really a problem anymore. And one of the reasons why this isn't so much of an issue nowadays is due to the rise of Flatpak. With Flatpak, you have access to newer versions of applications, newer than what most distributions ship nowadays. So with Flatpak, you could choose an individual application to upgrade to its latest and greatest version while keeping the rest of the packages on your Debian system the same. And this allows you, the user, to decide which applications you want to be at their latest and greatest versions and which ones you'd rather just have, well, left alone. And with Flatpak, that pretty much completely solves the software availability issue in Debian. And with containers, you could even utilize newer development libraries too. So nowadays, we're not really held hostage by which versions of applications our distribution provides. Instead of a distribution that features only antiquated software, Debian 12 is a distribution with a highly curated set of packages, and as a user, you can override that on a case-by-case basis. And for that reason, I no longer consider the outdated software issue to be an issue at all. However, applications that aren't released in a universal package format will still cause some annoyances when it comes to upgrading those, but considering how much of this situation has improved in Debian 12 overall, I'd say that's probably not going to annoy very many people. Another reason why Debian has never become my daily driver distribution is due to its poor hardware support. In fact, I've long considered Debian to have some of the worst hardware support of any Linux distribution out there. I mean, with every version released so far, you've had a next to zero chance of having Wi-Fi working out of the box, and also you'd suffer from poor gaming performance as well. And that's if a game runs at all. And again, the reason for this is due to hardware support largely being, well, not all that great in Debian. Now, some people out there are overly lucky with computers that only feature supported hardware. However, Debian has always chosen to forego any driver that they didn't have source code for, which has provided a very bad hardware enablement experience for its users. But they actually fixed this situation in Debian 12. And in my opinion, that's one of the most surprising and welcome changes within Debian 12. They even enable proprietary drivers with the default installer. That means that if you install Debian 12, you won't have as likely of a chance of having a driver issue or anything like that, because most things should work right out of the box. For this reason, I feel like Debian 12 is going to be a fantastic jumping on point for newcomers, and it's going to result in far fewer posts or complaints about Wi-Fi not working in user forums. Now the thing is, we were always able to use proprietary hardware within Debian. It's just that there were a few hoops to jump through in order to get everything working. Other distributions, such as Ubuntu, for example, figured this out a long time ago and, for the most part, offers full hardware enablement. For this reason, Debian has never become my daily driver. It's not that I don't know how to get proprietary hardware working. I've even created tutorials to teach you guys how to get that working. It's just something that I shouldn't have to mess with. It's something that no one should have to mess with. For me, I refuse to use a distribution that holds its users hostage over policy disagreements with vendors. Sure, I understand why proprietary drivers are a bad thing, but it's also not the user's fault, so stop punishing them. And that's what Debian decided to do. They're no longer punishing users for their hardware decisions. So after 30 years, Debian 12 finally does what it should have been doing all along. All of my hardware worked out of the box and I didn't have to mess with anything. And that's less time people will spend Googling or complaining in forums, and more time they'll spend getting work done. Now let's switch gears and talk about something else that I think people love about Debian, and that's the fact that it's relatively drama-free. Especially nowadays, I think Linux users will appreciate how Debian calls little attention to itself and isn't being steered by a corporation. Nowadays, the Linux community is seeing a lot of disruption. Since Debian 11, we've had CentOS change direction suddenly to the point where many organizations decided to no longer deploy it. We've had Ubuntu in the news multiple times for decisions that weren't very well received by their users. And even Red Hat, a company we once thought was super reliable, is now in a situation where they're laying people off. There's been a lot of changes. Meanwhile, Debian hasn't been in the news all that much aside from people reporting on the development process of Debian 12 itself. While Ubuntu's users complained about the snap format, and companies complained about the fact that CentOS changed direction, causing them to suddenly migrate their servers to compatible enterprise Linux alternatives, Debian's users were quietly getting their work done. And with all the drama nowadays, I think people can especially appreciate this. I'm not trying to insult any of the other distributions here, but that has been the state of the Linux community over the past few years. Debian 12 itself is a fantastic release, but given the overall state of the Linux community nowadays, I feel it's going to be received as even more refreshing than ever before. So, what are my final thoughts on Debian 12? Well, I have nothing but great things to say about it. Not only has Debian fixed some of the issues that I've found with it in the past, it's just a very refreshing experience, especially with all the drama in the Linux community. They've even fixed the hardware enablement issue, making it a great jumping on point for newcomers, so that's also a benefit, while Debian continues to be a very reliable distribution. This new release is even faster and more performant than ever before, and it even includes the latest Plasma desktop, so I feel like Debian 12 is going to be especially exciting for all of you out there that love the Plasma desktop. Now, earlier in the video, I mentioned that there's going to be a surprise ending, and here it is. With Debian 12, I am switching to Debian, and I'm not joking. Now, I've long been a supporter of Ubuntu Server for quite some time. I've even wrote a book about it, multiple versions of that book, in fact. But with Debian 12, I am actually switching to Debian as my primary platform going forward. As far as why I decided to make that decision, well, that's to be continued. I'm going to explain that in a future video, so make sure that you subscribe to Learn Linux TV for the latest in Linux, and also to see that video as soon as it comes out. Anyway, thank you guys so much for checking out this review. I hope you enjoyed Debian 12 as much as I've been, and I'll see you in the next video.